Scientists compared Black American DNA to every Native American tribe individually: Cherokee, Choctaw, Navajo, Lakota, hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own genetic signature, each shaped by thousands of years of separate history on this continent. One tribe kept standing out from all the others, not a faint trace, not approximate, a match so close and so historically documented that geneticists and historians have been circling it for decades without fully telling the story in public. And the reason why goes far deeper than anything mainstream history has ever taught. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Let's start with what the science actually established about Native American ancestry in Black Americans, because most people don't know the numbers, and the numbers are extraordinary. In 2014, a landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics used genetic data from hundreds of thousands of individuals through 23andMe to map the ancestry proportions of Black Americans in precise detail. The average Black American genome, they found, is approximately 73 to 75% African, about 24% European, and 0.75 to 1.2% Native American. That last number sounds small, but apply it to a population of 40 million people and it becomes something else entirely. The study found that more than 1 in 5 Black Americans, approximately 22%, carries detectable Native American ancestry when you lower the threshold to just 1% of genome-wide markers. That means roughly 8 to 9 million people of Black American descent carry measurable, traceable genetic segments that match Native American reference populations. And when the same team, along with researchers at Dartmouth and published in PLOS Genetics, mapped where that ancestry was concentrated geographically, one pattern emerged that rewrote everything most people assumed about this history. Oklahoma. In no other state does Black Native American ancestry appear at higher frequencies. More than 14% of Black Americans from Oklahoma carry at least 2% Native American ancestry genome-wide. In Oklahoma specifically, the history of America is written in the genome with a clarity that stunned even the researchers who found it. Katarzyna Bright, one of the lead scientists on the study, said in her own words, "You can really see historical events and historical migrations in the genetics. We weren't actually expecting to be able to see that as clearly as we do." What was written in those Oklahoma genomes was the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, the United States government forced 5 major Native American nations, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, off their ancestral lands in the American Southeast and relocated them to what is now Oklahoma. The journey killed an estimated 15,000 people. Children died of exposure. Elders died of starvation. Entire families were buried in unmarked graves along dirt paths that are now called the Trail of Tears. It is one of the most documented atrocities in American history. What is far less documented, what the history textbooks almost universally omit, is that those 5 nations brought enslaved Black people with them on that march. The 5 civilized tribes, as they were called by the U.S. government, had adopted the plantation system from their white neighbors in the Southeast. They held Black people as enslaved property. Some tribal members owned dozens of enslaved people, some owned hundreds. And when the Trail of Tears began, those enslaved Black men, women, and children walked the same forced march as their Native American enslavers, enduring the same exposure, the same starvation, the same brutal winter crossing of the Mississippi River, arriving in Oklahoma Indian Territory to build a new world that kept them in bondage. The census records confirm it. The U.S. Census of 1860 shows that Black slaves comprised a significant portion of the population in Oklahoma Indian Territory. The 5 civilized tribes held an estimated 8,000 enslaved Black people at the outbreak of the Civil War. After emancipation, those formerly enslaved people, now called the freedmen of the 5 tribes, were formally incorporated into tribal citizenship by treaty. For generations in Oklahoma, Black people and Native Americans lived in forced proximity. They shared land, labor, language, and, as the genetics now confirms, they shared ancestry. The contact between these two populations, concentrated in one specific geographic territory, created a genetic signature in Black Oklahomans that no other state can match. But that story, as shattering as it is only the second layer. The first layer goes back 3 centuries before the Trail of Tears, and it centers entirely on the Seminole. If you're finding this channel for the first time, subscribe now. Every video here is built from peer-reviewed science and documented history. No mythology, no speculation. The genome telling the truth that the textbooks left out. This series goes deep. Stay with us. The Seminole are unlike any other Native American nation in American history. They didn't begin as a single, unified people. They formed, they coalesced out of the violent chaos of early colonial Florida, assembling from fragments of tribes displaced by European invasion: Muskogee, Miccosukee, Appalachee, Yuchi, and others. The very name Seminole is derived from the Spanish word cimarron, a word that also gave us the English word maroon. It means free people, runaways, those who would not be caught. And from the early 1700s onward, the Seminole people shared their territory, their communities, and eventually their bloodlines with another group of people who were running. Escaped enslaved Africans from the Georgia and Carolina plantations, Maroons themselves fled south into Seminole territory in Spanish Florida. Where American slave catchers had no jurisdiction, the Seminole gave them refuge. What emerged over the following century was something America has never fully acknowledged: a genuine alliance, a shared civilization, a community that wore deerskin skirts and practiced West African dances simultaneously, that spoke Hichiti and Afro-Seminole Creole interchangeably, that organized itself through West African clan structures and Native American town governance at the same time. They grew corn together, hunted deer together, traveled the same waterways by canoe. Seminole settlements were connected to smaller, semi-autonomous affiliated Black villages by well-worn paths and extensive river systems stretching across the Florida interior. The historical record, documented by scholars at the Gilder Lehrman Institute and across numerous academic histories of Florida, is unambiguous. Indigenous Seminoles and African Maroons occasionally intermarried. Their children were raised in both traditions. Their grandchildren carried both ancestries. And over 2 centuries of this contact, before the First Seminole War, before the forced relocation to Oklahoma, before the United States had any legal authority over Spanish Florida at all, a new people had formed. A people who were neither purely African nor purely Native American. A people who were entirely, irreducibly both. These people were called the Black Seminoles, or in their own tradition, the Estelusti. And they did not live separately from the Seminole Nation. They intermarried for generations, across centuries. The genetics confirm what the history records. A study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics analyzed mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers in the Seminole tribe of Florida. It found that approximately 5% of Seminole maternal lineages, their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic code passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken line, belong not to a Native American haplogroup, but to African haplogroup L1. Haplogroup L1, the oldest maternal lineage on Earth, the lineage that traces back to sub-Saharan Africa, to West Africa specifically, to the same ancestral populations that produced the Yoruba, the Wolof, the Bakongo, the peoples whose descendants were loaded onto slave ships and brought to the American colonies. That haplogroup was now permanently embedded in Seminole DNA, not as a trace, not as a distant signal, as a measurable, reproducible genetic signature of West African maternal ancestry inside a Native American nation, a nation whose formal identity is defined by legal tribal enrollment, by cultural belonging, by the carrying of indigenous blood. The Seminole absorbed African ancestry into their genome, and African communities absorbed Seminole ancestry into theirs. They became, in the most literal biological sense, a single extended genetic family. Now let's understand why the match between Black Americans and the Seminole is so much stronger than with any other tribe. because it is not just about historical proximity, it is about the specific structure of how admixture entered both populations. When geneticists analyze admixed populations, they don't just measure how much of a given ancestry is present. They measure the length of the DNA segments that carry that ancestry. Longer segments mean more recent mixing. The DNA hasn't had time to break down through recombination across generations. Shorter segments mean older mixing. The ancestry has been in the population long enough to be shuffled and fragmented through many generations of reproduction. Think of it like tearing a piece of paper in half, then in half again, then in half again. After enough generations, the original page is in tiny pieces spread across a vast genome. You can still detect the paper, but it is very old. The Native American DNA segments in the average Black American genome are short. The PLOS genetics study that mapped this across 3,700 Black Americans found that the brevity of those segments indicates the contact happened early in the first generations of the slave trade, concentrated in the 1600s and early 1700s, before the plantation system was fully consolidated in the American interior. And where were enslaved Africans arriving in the 1600s and 1700s? Not in Oklahoma, not in the deep South yet. They were arriving on the coastal Southeast, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Florida, the exact territories where the Seminole and their predecessors lived, the exact geography where maroon communities formed, the exact borderlands where enslaved Africans first encountered and first mixed with indigenous Americans. The short segments in the Black American genome are not the result of the Trail of Tears. They are older than that. They are the genetic residue of 200 years of contact in the coastal Southeast, 2 centuries of shared survival between African maroons and the people who became the Seminole. But the connection between Black Americans and Native Americans does not stop at the colonial era, because there is a third layer to this story, one that no mainstream history class has ever taught, and it goes back not 200 years but 15,000. Every Native American tribe on Earth descends from the same founding population. Whether you are Navajo or Seminole, Cherokee or Lakota, Iroquois or Apache, your maternal ancestors all trace back to a small group of people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America approximately 15,000 to 16,000 years ago. Geneticists studying the mitochondrial DNA of hundreds of Native American communities found that 95% of all Native American maternal lineages descend from just 6 founding mothers, women whose mitochondrial haplogroups are now labeled A2, B2, C1b, C1c, C1d, and D1. Those 6 women were not African. They were Asian, descended from the same ancient East Asian populations that we discussed in the previous video in this series. Their ancestors had crossed out of Africa tens of thousands of years earlier, traveled through South Asia and East Asia, eventually reached the cold tundra of Siberia, and after spending thousands of years in the isolated land bridge region of Berinia, the now submerged landmass connecting modern Russia to modern Alaska, they crossed into the Americas approximately 15,000 to 16,000 years ago. Their descendants spread across an entire hemisphere, giving rise to hundreds of distinct nations, languages, and civilizations, but those 6 women were themselves descended through their own ancient female ancestors from the same African L3 maternal lineage that Black Americans carry today, haplogroup L3, the East African maternal lineage that originated approximately 65,000 to 70,000 years ago, is the direct grandmother of every non-African maternal lineage on Earth. Haplogroup M, which is common in East Asia, haplogroup N, from which European lineages descend, and haplogroup A, B, C, and D, the Native American founding lineages, are all daughters or granddaughters of haplogroup L3 through the ancient East Asian branch that populated Berinia. This means the 6 founding mothers of all Native American maternal ancestry, the 6 women from whom 95% of all Native American maternal lineages descend, were themselves the great-granddaughters, many times removed, of an African woman. a woman whose daughters walked all the way from East Africa to the Bering Strait and then into the Americas, which means that the L3 maternal lineage carried by Black American women and the A, B, C, D maternal lineages carried by Native American women share a common African great-grandmother from approximately 65,000 years ago. The Seminole woman who sheltered an escaped African enslaved person in the 1720s did not know that she and her guests shared the same ancient female ancestor from tens of thousands of years ago. The genomic research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, in PLOS Genetics, in the European Journal of Human Genetics, and in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences collectively shows that she did. Now let's address the part of this story that has been most aggressively buried, because the genetic evidence is only half the picture. The other half is the legal and political erasure that happened after the Civil War, an erasure that continues to affect tens of thousands of people alive today. After the Civil War, the 5 civilized tribes, including the Seminole, were required by treaty to grant citizenship to their former enslaved people. In the Cherokee Nation, this treaty granted freedmen all the rights of native Cherokees. The freedmen of the Seminole Nation were similarly incorporated into tribal citizenship. For generations, the descendants of Black Seminoles were enrolled members of the Seminole Nation. They were legally, politically, and culturally Seminole. Then in 2000, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma amended its constitution to require members to prove 1/8 Seminole blood quantum, a biological threshold defined not by intermarriage and community belonging, but by the colonial logic of blood purity that the Seminole had spent 2 centuries rejecting. The Black Seminole freedmen, many of whom carried genuine Seminole genetic ancestry from centuries of intermarriage, and all of whom carried the cultural and community ties of generational membership, were disenrolled, removed from the tribal roles, stripped of citizenship in the nation their ancestors had built alongside, fought alongside, and bled alongside for 200 years. In 2000, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma voted to exclude them. The federal government initially withheld funding from the tribe over the decision. Legal battles stretched across years, and the freedmen, people with Seminole names, Seminole community ties, and in many cases Seminole DNA, were told that without a blood quantum certificate, they did not exist as Seminole. A study published in academic research journals at the time noted the profound irony. The very genetic tools that could theoretically document Seminole ancestry and freedmen descendants were themselves inadequate to capture the full scope of a multi-generational mixed community. The Y chromosome traces only the paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA traces only the maternal line. They together represent just 2 of potentially hundreds of ancestral paths in a given person's genealogy. If intermarriage occurred on a great-grandparent's line that ran through neither the direct paternal nor direct maternal chain, it would be invisible to those tools. The people were real. The history was documented. The genetics were there, partial, measurable, real. But the legal system chose blood quantum over history, purity over kinship, and separation over the 2 centuries of shared life that had made the Seminole and their Black community into one people. The science has no interest in that political decision. The science simply reads what is in the genome. And what it reads, across the Seminole tribe of Florida's mitochondrial study, across the PLOS genetics map of Black Native American ancestry by state, across the 23andMe American Journal of Human Genetics study of 160,000 individuals, is this: of every tribe in North America, the Seminole carry African maternal ancestry directly in their own genome. The African haplogroup L1 is embedded in Seminole DNA in a way it is not embedded in the Cherokee or the Choctaw or the Navajo or the Crow. The contact was real. The mixing was real. The shared ancestry is real, and it runs in both directions. Seminole DNA in Black American genomes and African DNA in Seminole genomes. No other tribe in America can claim that bidirectional genetic exchange with Black Americans at the level the Seminole can. The match is not perfect in the genomic sense. Genetics does not work that way, and no 2 populations ever share 100% of their markers. But in the historical, cultural, and genomic sense, no two groups in North America are as deeply intertwined as Black Americans and the Seminole people. They shared food, they shared language, they shared war, they shared freedom, they shared children, and they shared DNA in both directions across generations for 2 full centuries before the United States government tried to legally separate what biology had already joined. One ran from plantation slavery, the other ran from colonial removal. They ran in the same direction. They found each other in the same swamp, and they wrote that meeting into their DNA. The genome does not know about blood quantum laws. It does not know about Dawes roles, or tribal enrollment cards, or the legal definitions of who counts as Seminole and who does not. It only knows that 2 populations across 2 centuries of shared survival exchanged enough of their ancestry to leave a permanent, measurable, reproducible signal in the cells of their descendants. That signal is still there. In Seminole DNA that carries West African maternal lineages. In Black American DNA that carries Native American haplotypes dating back to colonial Florida. In the shortened segments that tell geneticists this mixing was old, older than the Trail of Tears, older than the Civil War, older than any legal definition of who belonged to which nation. The Seminole and the people who became Black Americans were kin before America decided they were not. The genome always knew. Now you do too. Subscribe if this channel is showing you what the textbooks never did.